Hey folks, welcome back to the DarkHorse Podcast Livestream Q&A remote section. We are back to provide some A's to your Q's.
Question number 1. The Discord's Essay Club, awesome, incidentally. The Discord's Essay Club discussed Derrick Bell's Serving Two Masters, which is actual CRT, not pop CRT, critical race theory. Bell suggests, so this is not an essay that I have read, although from this question I think I should. It sounds interesting. Bell suggests in this essay, again, Serving Two Masters, that in Brown versus Board of Education, rather than ending the separateness of, quote, separate but equal, we could have cashed the but equal promissory note, improve black schools instead of forced integration. If we accept in arguendo, not a phrase I've heard before, but I like it. If we accept in arguendo that this would have been better for black students than integration and busing, how do we think about the morality of the still unequal, separate but improved scenario?
I'm trying to parse that last sentence.
I
sort of feel like it was separate. That's bad. But it's separate as a result of, frankly, separation in where people live, right? So the point is it's symptomatically separate. Unequal is a downstream consequence of the fact that we, at least in part, collect tax revenue locally and then spend it on schools so poor neighborhoods have less to spend. That's obviously a structural bias with very serious consequences. But the final punchline of the whole thing is that the entire educational system is failing across the board. And so therefore, it all needs a rethink.
Yeah, I mean, that's all true and not at all responsive to whatever we can understand the question to mean. I guess I would also say that it is well known, it is well established, and you have just alluded to the fact that your zip code, the zip code in which you grow up, is extraordinarily predictive of educational outcomes, and therefore ultimately sort of job and quality of life outcomes. And this is not, that means that we do not have equality of opportunity. But it is also true, you can take it farther back than that and say, well, because of largely historical, I'm not saying that there is no systemic racism left, but largely historical systemic racism, true that African-American families, for instance, have, and I don't have the stats in front of me, but much lower accumulated family wealth than do, say, white families in the U.S. And so it is that much lower accumulated family wealth that then is at least largely explanatory for why you have African-American families with, those with the greatest of intentions and educational aspirations unable to live in neighborhoods where the schools are good and being trapped in neighborhoods where the zip codes are predictive of poor schools and therefore poor educational outcomes. And then, to go back to where you, where you ended and where we started, and where you ended just now and where we started in the first hour, is the unfortunate truth that all education across all socioeconomic sectors now is failing in different ways in different places, but it's all failing.
Yeah, it's not going to fail to deliver the elite to the next class of elite,
right,
but it's failing to upgrade minds.
But what we haven't done is address this. Could we not do a better job of, as in the language of Derrick, who's asked the question, cashing the but equal promissory note, improving black schools instead of forcing integration?
Yeah, in fact, I've made the argument that the case for reparations is strongest for American blacks and American Indians, but that I don't think the case is very strong at all for cash payments. It's right. The case is for investment in communities.
In the systems that actually do have an effect, a causal effect on quality of life and ability to succeed.
I want to be cautious here. I don't think, you can't assume by the fact of unequal outcomes that it is these causes. I believe it is these causes that effectively, if you do give people equal opportunity, and not just like, hey, here's your equal opportunity, but a consistent level of opportunity such that people learn how to make use of it, that people are fundamentally the same. And so, but
family structure, just the degree of family wealth, which in turn is correlated not just with, the amount of rent or mortgage that you can afford, but just, the number of books you have in your home, the chances that your kid was read to as a kid. And, were you read to as a kid? It's really easy for a sort of naive, conservative, typical argument to be like, oh, that's because those people don't care about reading. It's like, no, maybe they just didn't have access to books.
Well, I have no trouble with the maybe, and I actually have no trouble with the belief that actually, if you did run the controlled experiment, you would find that this is causal. The problem is...
Which is causal?
The lack of accumulated family wealth being predictive of outcomes because not having the wealth bars reaching those outcomes. I believe that is true, but it is not clear.
Yes.
You could reverse cause and effect. Mm-hmm. So I think that will turn out to be false if we ever,
What will turn out to be false?
The idea that there is something inherent to populations that is actually causal and resulting in less accumulated wealth. I think there's nothing to that. But the point is, we can't assume there is nothing to it.
All right. If the U.S. is indeed suppressing data of adverse events from the public for the vaccines, why aren't we seeing these symptoms show up in data from other countries like Israel? I think we at least were.
Yeah, I don't accept the premise of the question.
Israel had mass really as close to 100% without being 100% vaccination early and practically simultaneously of any country, and it's small enough that it was actually able to take a lot of data, and then they were reporting the same kinds of adverse events. Early this summer, maybe, and I don't have I don't have the whole timeline and any of the research in front of me, but it has since sort of gone back onto the vaccine bandwagon. But it was becoming very hesitant for a while about boosters, even as it was becoming clear that that boosters would be needed to maintain any level of immunity.
Yeah. I think we do have an adverse event signal. What we don't have is systems that allow you to compare one country to another. So we've got, the European yellow card system or the British yellow card system. You've got the American VAERS system. Israel has a different system. Mm-hmm. And then you do appear to have a campaign of suppression of information and the misfiling of things, or at least the filing of things based on the assumption. We are now hearing about, where did I see a recent report on what explains the uptick in heart attacks, right? And, obviously this is a complex question. On the other hand, we have a prime candidate and a clear desire not to discuss the influence.
No, that sort of thing. And then also, I just saw someone picture on the side of a bus, children have strokes too, right? The sort of, the normalizing of once widely understood to be extraordinarily rare things in children, to be sort of put out there almost as trial balloons in advance of what may be, really hope not, but what may be an uptick in strokes in children as we have a rollout happening here. I don't remember this movie well enough to know how to answer this question.
I do.
Good. Go for it.
What movie are we talking about?
I don't know. I want to see what you can do. It's not fair.
No, it really isn't.
Is a situation like Monsters, Inc., a parasite feeding on neural energy, possible? Parasite feeding on neural energy. Like, what's the...
It depends how literal.
You need to, like, what is energy, right? Like, in what way...
Can you parasitize cognition? Absolutely. Gadsad has a book on this.
Sure.
But
is it a parasite in the literal?
Yes, metaphorically.
In the literal ancient meaning, like is it is it a tick or so, is it something tick-like as opposed to your own species parasitizing your cognition?
Let's put it this way. Both a literal parasitizing of the energy is technically possible, probably not very interesting. And
I don't know how you get there. Like what parasitizing of the energy, like I feel like you need a better.
Could a life form exist that is fueled by energy stolen from cognitive structures? Sure. I see no reason it couldn't exist.
Sure.
Metaphorically speaking, something much more interesting is possible, and in fact, should be unarguable that we have this, right? I mean, for one thing, every boss who takes advantage of the powerlessness of underlings and their creativity,
right,
is parasitizing mental energy in a sense. So yeah, it's all possible. But I'd love to know what the question means more specifically to be able to answer it better than that.
Fair enough. Might rising birth intervention trend correlate better with obesity than lazy doctors? So what I think this means is we talked about doctors sometime recently, although I don't honestly remember exactly what the conversation was, but we talked recently about the increase in, for instance, C-sections and like episiotomies and epidurals and just like lots of medicalization of birth. And attributing some of it to it being easier to schedule. And I don't think we use the word lazy with regard to doctors. I think it's the business model. It's market driven. It's, of course, everyone would like to, not be, forced into work in the middle of the night. Although, frankly, if that was one of your key driving preferences in life, perhaps you shouldn't have become an obstetrician. It seems fairly obvious to me, because we are complex systems. We are not, this is not, helping birth is not a process for an engineer. It's a process for a biologist, right? To the degree that you could have a doctor with an engineer's mentality or a doctor with a biologist mentality. That said, is maternal obesity likely to make birth harder? Yes. Yes, it is.
So I don't know.
We know this to be true, although I don't know to what degree. Of course, you're always heavy at the point that you're giving birth. You've always gained some weight. You have to have gained considerable more weight than the 7 to 8 pound baby that you're carrying. Several tens more pounds than that if you're healthy. But so what would it mean to be like 40 pounds over what you're supposed to be as opposed to 100 pounds? I don't know at what point you really are at more risk because you're heavy.
Yeah, but I think the question imposes a restriction that's unnecessary.
An either or?
Well, that it's obesity, right? What we have is increased complexity that comes from ample nutrition and
so metabolic syndrome, diabetes.
But even just the fact that people in the West, even people who are at a healthy weight in the West, are so thoroughly well nourished, and the babies are so thoroughly well nourished that to the degree that the birth of a human baby is a challenge to a woman, her physiology, babies tend to be larger because the brakes on the baby getting too large are not as well developed, since our ancestors tended to be resource stressed.
No, but what I don't know, so a fatter baby should not make for a harder birth. It's the head size. It's the head circumference.
It's the fat heads you need to watch out for.
It's the fat heads you need to watch out for, and I don't know if a better nourished mother gives birth to a baby at term that has a bigger head, which would be necessary for what you're talking about to be related to increased complexity in birth if the mother and until then fetus are simply well nourished in modern terms.
Well, let's just say these answers are not mutually exclusive. I do believe that there is a clear, though I didn't know the question was coming, haven't looked into it, but I believe there is a clear trend towards well nourished mothers giving birth to larger babies, and therefore there being a challenge. Presumably, obesity contributes even another step of complexity and difficulty, as do sedentary lifestyles that cause musculature not to be as well developed. All of these things are likely contributors, and the question would be, what fraction of the
Yeah.
the medicalization is the result of doctors scheduling stuff
Yeah.
around.
Well, and it's not even just scheduling stuff. Like, I'm just thinking about, at least in the US for hospital births, unless you explicitly, unless you go out of your way and you have to be at the right hospital to even be able to do this, birth is lying down, which is going to be harder on mother and baby, but easier for the attending staff. And if you're hooked up to IVs or had an epidural or any number of the ways that that medicalization happens now, you're not going to have an easy time, or maybe be simply stopped from walking around. And actually, yes, move your body all the time, for sure. We say that all the time, but especially in the run up to birth. Like, this is going to be the thing that's going to get the contractions coming faster, and get you to have a birth that is going to happen sooner rather than later, which, once you're in labor, that's what you want. And the medicalization, which may or may not have to do with, laziness or scheduling or obesity or anything else, once you're in that position, it's even harder. You're even more likely to have a complicated birth once you've started to complicate it by restricting the movement of the mother.
Yep.
Can we cite articles we have not purchased? In memoriam, Aaron Schwartz.
Well,
I don't know if this is an anniversary or like why that comes up right now.
I don't know why it comes up. I mean, it may not be temporal at all. It may just be that Aaron Schwartz was being pursued for having to liberate articles that we paid to produce as citizens who pay taxes and we're not allowed to see.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I have no doubt that people regularly cite articles that they have not read and have not purchased access to.
Well, purchased is different from read.
Yep.
I cite and read a lot of articles that I don't purchase.
Sure. In honor of Aaron Schwartz. But
I'll just say, the sort of his efforts. I don't know to what degree it's understood as an academic, as an intellectual descendant, but Sci-Hub, which I started sort of having to use at the point that we lost access to Princeton University's research library, whenever that was, last summer, and had been using a little bit in sort of 2018 as well. Actually had been trying to use a lot, and I found it really not up to the job, and increasingly it is up to the job. And we also, there are some more journals now that are doing open access, or at least limited. We'll say, you can have X number of peer-reviewed articles before we start charging you.
Yep. People cite articles they don't read all the time based on abstracts. Obviously, that's going to sometimes be the result of people not having access to the article and not pursuing it through Sci-Hub or whatever. Obviously, this is a dumb system. If we're paying for the research, not being able to read it is absurd. Obviously, the positive feedback that comes from better resourced institutions having access to more journals, and therefore academics at those institutions being able to write papers that are based on a wider read of the literature, is an absurdity.
Yep, it's positive feedback.
Yeah, like everything else, this needs a total rethink.
Yep. And there are, the sort of the end runs, which are, none of the Elsevier doesn't want Sci-Hub to exist. But there are sort of intermediate things, and I don't know exactly what the formal position by Elsevier is across the board for things like, like ResearchGate and academia.edu, I want to say, although I'm not sure that's right, but places where researchers themselves, authors of research articles themselves, can put up PDFs of their own work.
Yeah.
And so, if you're doing a search on Google Scholar, very often, if there's a link to a PDF, it will be through, you're not going to get a Sci-Hub link that way, but you'll often get a ResearchGate or an academia link that way.
Yeah, and there's an ambiguity here, right? You're not allowed to, print off a copy of a copyrighted book, but I can buy a book and I can give it or loan it to you without violating a copyright. can the author of a scientific work hand it out. That's always been traditional. You could write to the author and they will send you the PDF and you don't have to pay for it.
Yeah, but digital handouts change the rules. And yeah.
Right. But I think the thing that is most interesting here, what we should really say, is you and I have again and again said, look, we are willing to pay a fee to simply have access to the kind of libraries that we had when we were at Michigan, for example.
That's right.
It does not appear to be possible.
That's
and this
right.
is a tremendous mystery because so many people, whether it's journalists or independent scholars or whatever, need the access. And this is one way. It's basically an artificial monopoly on knowledge.
Yes.
And it's disastrous. It's despicable. And it's amazing that the market hasn't figured out that there is a price that people would be willing to pay in order to simply have full access.
No, it's huge. And actually, I purchased access to science just in order to get their full rundown every week of what they think the most important things were happening every week were, and to be able to read the full articles because most those articles aren't going to be available other ways right away, right? You can't. Anyone who is in any way a generalist as a scientific thinker cannot purchase. Simply go, okay, well, I'm going to purchase like the really big ones like Science and Nature, and also, the 5 journals in my field, and then I'm covered. That's fine if what you're working on is so narrow, and you've basically said to yourself and to the world, nothing that is in any way outside of my very blinded, narrow scope is of interest to me. Then, yeah, you're staying up on the research such as it is. But just like roaming the stacks of an actual physical library allows for serendipity, allows for you to discover books or journals or whatever it is that you didn't even know existed, much less were interested in, so too does actually having access to a world-class library in electronic form allow you to do searches. Some of these indexing databases that don't necessarily have the full text, but allow you to do searches that are more powerful even than, the Google Scholar search, or at least this was true until a couple of years ago. And then go, oh, wow, look at all of these things across journals that I may not have even heard of, much less am going to put down, a couple $100 for a year's subscription for a journal for whom there's one article right now that I think I might be interested in. No, you need research university quality access to libraries. And it's astounding that, yes, although anyone can buy access to an individual journal if they want for a year, and it's not cheap. What you do not appear to be able to buy, at least you didn't the last time we looked actively into it a year and a half or 2 ago, was access of the sort that you get at an R1 university library, at a research university library.
And, if you're at a lower tier place, you have interlibrary loan agreements often. However, the point is it still provides this massive advantage to the people at the R1s because the way research works, if you're working on a general topic, as I was doing with telomeres, where I was dealing with journals that I'd never read before because I was in a literature that wasn't my home turf, right? You could read a paper, you find something important that you need to chase down, and you're in its bibliography, you get that paper, you're 3 or 4 papers deep before you know what it is that you're, whether this is a fruitful avenue or not.
Exactly.
That could be weeks down the road if you're doing it through interlibrary loan, whereas it could be an hour down the road if you're doing it looking at the papers and able to source them electronically.
That's right. And this is actually, at least at the point that we left Evergreen, it was the case that in Washington state, unlike in California, all of the public institutions in the state did not get access to the electronic library resources of the flagship institution, the flagship public institution, which is University of Washington. So in California, no matter what community college you're at, or Cal State University or UC University you're at, if you are faculty, staff, student at any public institution of higher ed, 2-year, 4-year, doctorate, undergraduate, whatever, in California, you have access to the electronic library database for the entire system. Whether or not you've ever set foot on Berkeley's campus, you obviously, interlibrary loan for actual books will take some time, right? But the journals, which is where most of the cutting edge research tends has tended to be published, was available to you just as easily if you're a community college student as if you were a PhD student at UCLA or Berkeley. Whereas in Washington, what was, unfortunately quite obvious very quickly to us, being at one of the public institutions in the state, was that Washington had no such agreement, such that UW's amazing first-class Research One library was not available to anyone else in the state. And this is, it's, I don't know if predatory is exactly the right word, but it's certainly regressive and aggressive and deeply competitive.
It's exclusionary.
And it's exclusionary. And what is public education for, if not even to make equal the opportunity to the research among all of the students who are engaged in the public education system, right? Much less all of us who aren't at some formal institution.
Yeah, for one thing, it turns people who would pursue the information on their own into obligate consumers.
Right.
Right. So
Yes.
you have to accept a fact check in lieu of going to check the facts yourself because you don't have access to the journals necessary to do it. And this may seem a small matter, but at the moment, we really need high quality science journalists. And the problem is this is a barrier to their functioning because
Yep.
they will always be hobbled relative to the journalists who have the access purchased by, major papers or whatever.
Yep. Next question. What role does counseling and psychotherapy play in the evolutionary world? It's my field of work and study. People are always shocked at how well it works.
Well, I have a little riff on this, which so far has landed well with people who are professionals in the area, which is that there is a tremendous amount of good to be done by counselors. Those who are really good at it are not good at it because of the training. What we formally understand about these things is small, but in some sense, and I think I said this to Jordan Peterson on our last podcast together, the role of counselor, which might have been played by a very close friend or a clergyman or something like that in the past, has now been turned over to the market. We now source it a la carte from a professional who is paid to give a shit. And that's not an upgrade. That the idea of somebody who tracks the details of your life and cares about you for deeper reasons is probably a much healthier thing. And so I guess the last thing I would say is there's always been something odd and not healthy about the fact that psychology is simultaneously the study of the mind, let's say, and also a clinical practice of helping people in need. The two things have precious little to do with each other. And in fact, we've just seen this in the replication crisis, which of course will not be limited to psychology, but the fact that psychological results have overwhelmingly been unreproducible is not a surprise to some of us, right? This is difficult work to do, and the perverse incentives and brokenness of the structure that is supposed to filter this for only the highest quality, most robust conclusions, it's nonsense. And so what academic psychologists think they know may or may not mean anything, but it doesn't mean that you walk into the office of somebody who has an understanding of people and you hear what they have to say based on what you tell them and that it isn't helpful.
Yeah.
But, those aren't the same process.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this person says people are always shocked at how well it works. We know one very well, and of another, active clinical psychologists who are extraordinary, utterly extraordinary at what they do. And part of, exactly as you say, it's just not. In the person who we know very well, her educational background was cool, but I don't think she thinks it's directly relevant either, right? So it is like I've said about body work, right? That there is you need to know. In the case of body work, like it very much helps to actually understand the underlying physical and biological systems, but that's not sufficient. And you might be arguing that you don't even need sort of the background stuff with regard to, being an effective clinical psychologist. In order to be a good body worker, you need to have the hands, and it's not clear that you can learn it, but it's not clear that it can be taught to you. Like you may sort of have the nascent ability to feel what you need to feel as you're working on someone else's body, and some people don't seem to be able to learn it. And the same thing may be true for clinical psychologists and counselors, that you just you can either really get into someone's head who you didn't necessarily know very well before, and also hold yourself at enough distance to, or just act as an actually good friend, as opposed to sort of the modern version of good friend who just nods along and goes, yeah, that's terrible, honey, even if you think actually you're doing something that's bad for you. So a counselor, of course, is going to be someone who's pushing back and not leaving you simply feeling awesome in the moment, because awesome in the moment is almost never going to be the best therapy for long-term awesomeness.
Yeah. I mean, this is a different realm of literally false metaphorically true, right?
Yeah.
You may or may not understand the underlying mechanism. You may be describing it accurately or not. The real question, though, is do you intuit what's going on based on what you're hearing, and can what you reflect back cause the person to see something that they don't see, or to, recalibrate their values, or how well they're meeting them, or whatever it is that causes their life to be enhanced.
Yes. I don't know if you have an answer to this, but I'll ask it. I rewatched your Kory interview. Anything new we need to know? Winter is coming.
Pierre and I keep in touch. I will say there is a battle over the same fundamental questions, depending upon where you're standing. I hear people claim all the time that effectively, it has been established that ivermectin doesn't work, and that it's time for those of us who thought that maybe it did to acknowledge that and move on. And it's almost impossible to imagine what these people are talking about, because it is not as if some picture like that has emerged anywhere. Right? Are there things worth knowing? Yes, there appears to be a concentration of fraudulent academic work in the Middle East, and that includes ivermectin, right?
But it's also like the number of people, for instance, that are saying, the anosmia post-COVID wouldn't go away, and then, ivermectin treated it.
Right. So anyway, I guess the point is it's still noisy. What the ultimate truth of it is, I don't think anybody knows, but Pierre Kory is treating people in a clinical setting. He knows things most of us can't know firsthand.
Right.
So anyway, yes, it's an ongoing, interesting saga, and it is worth paying attention. If it looks all very wrapped up and clear from where you're standing, try standing somewhere else. You'll discover something interesting.
Yeah. I don't know what we can say about this, but are randomized controlled trials the gold standard? And then he's got two partial references here, neither of which I recognize from Theory, Cartwright, published in Lancet, April 2011, and Example, Thacker, published in British Medical Journal, or BMJ is what it says. I think it might be BJ. I can't remember. November 2021. Are they the gold standard?
No.
That's sort of a simple answer, but yeah.
There are a couple things going on. One, so first of all, you need to understand something about the difference between systematic and random error, right? Systematic error sounds less bad because it sounds not so chaotic, but in fact, it's the thing to worry about. Systematic error is errors that mislead in a particular direction. Random error is just noise, phenomena that you're not monitoring that affect your data set. And the point
partially that's what statistics are for.
Well, the point is statistics work for random error. Larger sample sizes and proper statistical methods deal with this, so you can eliminate the influence of noise on your thinking. Systematic error does not. And so the point is a randomized controlled trial with a systematic error built into it can absolutely mislead you. Now, this is the reason that some of us say this counterintuitive thing about, in fact, meta-analysis is superior, because it corrects for systematic errors, because systematic errors, if they are honestly made, do not all tend to go in the same direction. Mm-hmm. So if you look at multiple studies, some treat too early, some treat too late, who knows? The point is they tend to drown each other out. And what you're left with is the signal. So,
But if they are honestly
made, rather than science is a
all in the
fragile
same direction.
process and some forces creating an incentive to produce studies that all treat late and therefore blah, 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 blah. So basically, if you're looking at comparison between meta-analysis and randomized controlled trial, meta-analysis, if well done, is superior. The big thing we have to fear is systematic error, especially in the context of randomized controlled trial, which seems sacred to many people who don't understand how messy that process actually is. But also, there are other kinds of evidence that, to the extent that you have actually done difficult work, you know are really important, right? So, for example, the clinical impression of doctors who have actually treated with a drug, for example, this is a hugely important kind of evidence. Right? It is disfavored because it is hard to know exactly how you calculate it. But the amazing bias of those who have used, for example, ivermectin in the direction of, yes, this actually does work, is telling us something, and throwing it out because you don't know exactly how to integrate it with randomized controlled trials is nonsense.
Very good. If culture serves the genes, why have we such varied religions and musics, etc.? Music. Do the same. This person didn't write musics. I said musics. I'm going to start over.
Like musics.
If culture serves the genes, why do we have such varied religions and music, etc.? Do the same traits evolve in species separate of each other? Why not culture, all down to environment? I'm not sure what the last parts of this mean exactly, but the first part is about there being no universal best. Right, like everything about fitness is relative to a particular environment, space, and time, and it is an error of thinking that has been pretty widespread in the adoption of sort of pseudo-Darwinian thinking into places like the Third Reich and sort of robber barons imagining that because they're wealthy they ought to be wealthy, and that's an indicator of how awesome they are. And some people are wealthy because they're awesome and they worked hard, and but for some people that has nothing to do with it. So indicators of fitness are relative, and that's the short answer to why there's so many varied cultures and musics.
Yeah, and we specifically make the argument, for example, that monogamy is adapted to population expansion because it brings all adults of parenting age into parenting, and that polygyny is likely adapted for zero-sum circumstances where making war on neighboring populations may be advantageous, which is not the same thing as good, but advantageous to the population. So the basic point is there are two things function, or maybe it's even three things functioning at once. One, two populations that are separated long enough will adapt independently of each other, even if their environments are the same, right? There's a randomness in the process that will result in languages, for example, diverging, even if there's no functional reason for them to. Mm-hmm. Second thing is you have adaptation to different circumstances, which will cause divergence. And anyway, so you have adaptive differences, you have arbitrary differences, and the expectation that these things, you also have convergences. That's the third thing, is that sometimes two structures will converge that do the same job. So I've made the argument, for example, that guilt and karma are two different versions of a similar solution.
What and karma? Sorry.
Guilt.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Guilt, the debt you pay for having done something wrong, mm-hmm. right? Rather than the belief that it's going to come back to haunt you.
Yeah.
Those both discourage bad behavior, right? And there may be reasons that they could be adaptively different or they could mm-hmm. be arbitrarily different. But the idea that you get two different solutions to the same problem is not surprising. Evolutionarily, we see that all the time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think it quite works, but what you put me in mind of is like, with regard to reproductive investment, males tend to invest prezygotically and females tend to invest postzygotically across many, many species. And, guilt is like the internal, it's not a pre-post, but guilt and karma are again sort of, internal versus external
Right. And
locus of something. I'm not sure what.
It's complex too, because, your guilt may be a proxy for the sky god saw you do it, and that's going to count against you in the ledger, and that's going to result in you being one step closer to the lake of fire, right? So guilt would be sort of an internalized pressure not to do that kind of thing, or to fix it. But anyway, they clearly are at least in the same neighborhood in terms of the problem that they solve.
Indeed. In an economy where incomes are ever more stretched, can we afford a true liberal arts education? Is it in society's best interest to provide it for free or integrate it into high school education? Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, the financials are exactly very, very sticky and tricky, as we were talking about, and having an endowment to start that allows you to be free of, how do you provide it for free? Someone's got to pay the faculty and the administrators, and for the campus and for the upkeep, and for all of that. And what we've seen now is so many bad ideas that have been instantiated in part because of overreach of things like granting agencies and accreditors into the actual education, that desiring free education, sounds lovely, but nothing is actually free, and who's paying for it, and what strings does that come with? So, having a model with that starts with so much base funds that you never need acquiesce to the demands of those from whom you would ask for more funds is a goal that may be unattainable.
So you and I come out a little bit different here, and I have no doubt that we could hammer out those differences and we'd end up in the same place. But my sense is liberal arts is done. That the core idea that it's a little bit like the constitutional framework. Liberal arts cannot contain the thing it needs to contain, and it has already failed so badly that rescuing it is a mistake. That the idea that one should be educated in a way that provides breadth to the mind for use later across the duties of a citizen, across one's vocation, all of those things, that is a good idea. The problem is we have not had a conversation, I have not been privy to a conversation in our lifetimes about, given a finite amount of time in which to educate young people, what is the optimal collection of things that should be delivered, right? What is the optimal collection of skills, exposures, insights that results in a platform, a foundation to go on and be successful and satisfied and effective in life? And that will have changed radically by virtue of the fact that the human mind, at least the human brain, hasn't gotten any bigger. The human mind is presumably constrained by the brain, and the amount that one could study has gone way up, and therefore the chaos in an edit on what we might imbue is going to result in very different collections of things. And so I think the liberal arts has sort of become an excuse for not delivering a coherent package. And so there's a part of me that thinks actually that given that there's far too much for us to expose you broadly across it, that we ought to figure out what it is that stands in for the full breadth that works. And we ought to figure out how one delivers it. But we've also got a question about wildly unequal capacity to take on that package based on the failure of, grade school of every kind,
Well, but not just on the student end, but on the faculty end as well. But so you and I do disagree. Like I am not giving up on the liberal arts, including the name. I was, and to some degree that may be a semantic disagreement. I think a couple 5 years ago, I was prepared to just give up on the term feminism, for instance, like, it's just done, it's over. But I'm feeling more now like, no, I want the word back. And I have not yet been interested in giving up on, and I tend to say the more complete phrase, liberal arts and sciences, because that is what has always been meant by it.
Yep.
And I do think, and this is a place actually where I think the University of Austin project stands to do something really interesting, that Pano Canelos, the president, is the just past president of St. John's in Annapolis, which is the third oldest college in the United States, and has in some ways the opposite kind of curricular structure to that of Evergreen, in which all the faculty teach all the stuff, but it is a circumscribed set of things, of wisdom from the ancients and to some degree the moderns, that all students who end up with a degree from St. John's end up having on board. And they, it's mostly seminar rather than sort of sage on the stage style learning. And they don't tend to have, very much, if at all, sort of natural science, and certainly not big science, but, big instrumentation and such. Compared to the Evergreen model, where you can have faculty who really take advantage of the model and manage to bring in lots of the stuff that needs to be in the brains of people who are moving forward into the world and trying to make a difference. But it also allows for nothing at all to have been imparted if the faculty don't feel like imparting anything. So I think both of those models actually stand to be potentially critical, but one of the big questions underlying certainly the St. John's model, which I think is the thing that you're maybe responding to, not per se, but is, okay, but what are the things?
Right.
Like what are the things in 2021, as opposed to say, how often are there upgrades to what, or updates to what it is that is thought to be absolutely necessary, and then what gets pulled, like what now is not in the required curriculum, because you can't just keep adding, because you're not going to keep on adding years to the college education.
Right. So this is exactly the question I'm trying to point to, is you've got a question of the model and a question of the content. And I believe a model that contains enough breadth is essential, but that no old set of content is going to work. I mean, for one thing, I don't exactly know when liberal arts became a concept. Do you know offhand?
I can't place it. It's certainly, it's at least mid 20th century, but I think it's before that.
Yeah, I think it's.
But the sort of the model of the modern university, which is sort of Germanic, and it goes farther back than that, but is sort of turn of the last century.
But it seems to me, no people will think this is me saying it because it's my discipline and therefore I care about it, but it's quite the other way around. It's my discipline because I thought it was so freaking important that it took over my life. But the idea that people graduate from college and know nothing about the evolutionary process that built them is a tremendous error. Right? The number of times one meets a doctor who knows almost nothing about evolution and just sort of takes the body as a complex mechanism rather than something built to answer certain kinds of problems, right? It's a terrible error. So somewhere in your educational experience, you need to be exposed to that thing, and that doesn't mean Darwin's model of speciation. It means something much deeper. So it should be there, right? As well as mathematical literacy that allows you to evaluate claims about, to understand what statistical significance does and doesn't mean, for example.
Right. Okay, we got so many good questions that we aren't going to get to. We have about 10 minutes left. Let's try to do a few in fairly rapid.
All right.
So this is a simple one. Really, really, really not. Please talk about the structures, function, and modification of insect antennas, the evolution of the human five senses, and human consciousness.
Yes.
I am actually super impressed that many things got put into a question that short.
I think it's a joke. What were the things?
Structures, function, and modification
of
insect antennas, the evolution of human five senses, and human consciousness.
Yeah, that's definitely a joke. It's a good one. I like it.
Okay. We're not going to, okay.
I think there's just
it's
not a tractable question.
Okay, good. Chesterton's gallbladder. Convince me why we, read I, ever needed the damned thing.
Oh, you never did.
No. Don't
Well, no.
Don't listen to him. What?
Needed. We know you don't need it. A lot of people get by without it. I mean, you can make the same argument for, look, let's take the appendix, because this is the place where we've got this all nailed to a fairly well, right? The point is, do you need your appendix? No. How do we know that? Because lots of people get along without it, right? Is the appendix valuable? Yes, the appendix appears to be valuable. You could have inferred that long before we knew what the value was, based on the fact that this is an organ with an expense that persists over time, a complexity, an expense, and a persistence over time. We now believe we have some insight into what it does. It appears to do something very useful, much more so to your ancestors than to you, which is to preserve basically an instantiation of your gut flora, so that when bacterial...
So you're talking about the appendix, not the gallbladder.
Right.
Yeah.
The point is, when you experience bacterial warfare that causes your gut to empty or the flora to be changed over to something that is not in your interest, you have this isolate that is capable of repopulating your gut with the appropriate stuff. Now, the reason that this is not that important to a modern is that we're so well fed that we don't really need to be all that efficient with respect to extracting nutrition from our food. That does not mean that this is not a difference between life and death for an ancestor who doesn't have enough resources. So, necessary.
Okay, but we're trying to do quick answers, and you just talked about the appendix, which the question was not at all about.
Right.
So the gallbladder breaks down fats, roughly, right? I don't know enough about the ways that gallbladders fail on people, although it sounds like from the question that this person's gallbladder is actually either giving them trouble or, and I do know that sometimes gallbladders get taken out. The people, yes, as you say, can live without their gallbladder. But breakdown of fat into constituent pieces is a necessary part of the process of...
I don't think that's what it does. I think it produces bile, which emulsifies fat, which makes it more efficient for you to access it. So the reason that it's very analogous to
it is, yes, I skipped the bile part, but
But there's a difference between
emulsification and breakdown.
It's the emulsification,
yes,
which gives you more surface area, so you're more effective at getting the goodness out of the fat. But the point is, you don't need it. You're a modern. You've got...
I would be very careful. Neither you nor I have thought as much about gallbladders as we have about appendixes.
Appendices.
I think that's not right. I wanted to say appendices.
I really want it to be right.
You just don't want to answer this question. So
I think we did. I think we did a slam dunk on this question. You probably don't need it, but it probably has...
I am not comfortable with that answer at all. I'm not going to say that.
Okay. I said probably.
Computers use base 2, zeros and ones, while DNA uses base 4. G, C, A, and T. Might this explain some of the gap we see between AI and true consciousness? If so, how?
I don't think that's the place. And I'm going to give you a secret of the universe. The place is not the binary versus quaternary. It's that each neuron has a binary end, the axon, and an analog end, the cell body.
So digital and analog.
Yeah.
That there's this this movement between digital and analog, digital analog.
Right. And there is something that I think we do not understand about what is possible in a hybrid realm. Now, I'm sure computer scientists will say, we've got hybrid realm, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
Or, if you get enough digital, it becomes analog. Okay, true, get it. But nonetheless, each neuron is functioning as its own kind of computer. And it's a computer that develops a kind of, I don't know if you'd call it intelligence, but the way that the dendrites grow and connect, which then changes the necessary conditions to fire off an action potential down the axon. That thing is calculating. Each neuron is calculating something, in many cases, remarkably complex, because despite what the damn picture says in your goddamn textbook, right? A picture in your textbook has 16 dendrites sticking off the cell body. But in many cases, you're talking 1,000, 2,000 connections. It's amazing.
And really active, both growth and apoptosis. I don't know if that's exactly what's going on there, but reabsorption and growth to new connections.
You're talking about of the dendrites rather than the whole cell, yeah. So not apoptosis.
That's what you were talking about. Number of dendrites, yeah.
Right, the connections. Right, it's an amazing calculator in and of itself.
And that we've known for a while. As it turns out, there is actually new neuronal generation as adults as well. Which at the point that we were in undergrad and grad school, that was not thought to be the case for the most part. But even that we now know actually is happening. But yes, dendritic growth, and not just growth, but the flip side of that, which is equally important, of losing connections that you once had. With the simple version is like you don't use it and you lose the connection, is just as important to retaining a coherent system.
Yep.
Magnesium helps
Indeed.
process vitamin D. Magnesium deficiency looks like long COVID. Magnesium should be in the water. Magnesium helps process vitamin D. Yes. Magnesium deficiency looks like long COVID. Interesting. I hadn't thought that in exactly those terms, but what I can pull up from my head right away, I think that's right. Magnesium should be in the water. I don't think so. I don't think that putting things in our water supply should be the way that we do these things. That supplementing in some foodstuffs like D is in a lot of milk, where you can also buy that foodstuff without it if for whatever reason you decide you don't want it. Or for instance, fluoride in toothpaste but not in water supply makes much more sense.
All right. Point of order. Mm-hmm. It is ambiguous whether they're suggesting that it should be added to water or whether it should be in the water by virtue of the fact that some amount of it tends to be in water.
I read this as a prescription. If it's sort of like, even if you are, you own your own family farm and you're growing food organically, there is some chance that your vegetables are deficient compared to those of your ancestors growing on the same soils 100 years ago or 500 years ago, simply because our soils are being stripped because of everything else going on in our modern world. If magnesium should be in the water and it's not because of hyper novelty of our modern environment, that's a different question than a prescription. It should be added. I don't think it should be added.
Well, let's put it this way.
You
may need to supplement. I don't love the idea of water because, for one thing, the amount of water consumed therefore adjusts the dosage massively.
That's right.
And so it's a mistake as a place to put it. Now,
that
said, the iodine in salt is something that it's possible there's a reason to have an objection to it, but it has done a tremendous amount of good. It has the same flaw where people consume much different levels of iodine, therefore, because they consume much different levels of salt. But in that case, I'm not sure that we know of a harm that comes from the fact that the dosage is not titrated based on...
I don't remember. I don't think we know of a harm because the dose isn't titrated, but I stopped buying for us, since I am the official salt buyer of the family, iodized salt some years ago, and have been buying sea salt, which has more of the other nutrients but doesn't have iodine added in particular.
Right.
But also the sort of sea salts don't tend to have the caking agents and all the other stuff. And I don't remember. I did my research at the time, and I don't remember what the reason was.
All right, I want to take back my position. Yeah. I don't know of the harm from the iodine, but we also do know of a lot of thyroid issues, which could well be the result of different levels of iodine. Mm-hmm. And so it is quite possible that there is the same harm there, and I'm just not connecting them. Nonetheless, I think the point is you may or may not need to supplement on any given front.
Right.
Doing some sort of broad scale public thing has a massive cost in terms of titration, and you're far better off to correct a problem if you have one. And the problem could be your water source. If it's desalinated, then it may have lost all of its minerals. You may be deficient for that reason. Your ancestors may have come from a place with ample whatever in the soil, and you may be living in a place in which it's not in your water, and supplementation is necessary to correct the mismatch. Yep. But awareness of these mismatches is, I think, a higher priority than you and I have realized until very recently.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. 2 more comments and then one last question, and then we are out for the week. This just greetings from Somerset, UK. Love you both. Love your work, Charlie. Thank you, Charlie. And it doesn't matter how you say the word, giraffe will always look down on you.
Nice.
Finally, we're skipping lots of good questions here. Sorry for that, guys. But here's the last question that we're going to get to this week. As a secular parent, how can I help my 6-year-old daughter deal with death?
Well, This is one of these questions. I sort of think it's almost upside down, right? There's this thing.
Upside down. Okay. I don't know.
I'll give you a couple examples. A father whose son had been attacked by a mountain lion, and the father had courageously fended off the mountain lion, and the child was injured but pretty well okay, was asked how his son was doing. And he said, it's odd. He's obviously a little shaken by it, but in some sense, he's so young that he doesn't know that this isn't just something that happens, right? Likewise, in Afghanistan, 20 years ago, somebody was talking about these kids who had nerves of steel, and bombs could be going off not too far away, but because it was what they knew, it didn't throw them the way it would throw you or me. And the basic point is, in some sense, you're projecting your own adult sensitivities onto a child, and children have dealt with death, far more death than us moderns deal with, that we're built for it. And it doesn't mean it isn't terribly sad, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't open up philosophical questions, and it doesn't mean that you're as well armed to deal with it as a parent who does have the tools of they're in a better place. But I don't know of a child who learns of death and is crippled by the knowledge of it, right? Yeah. It's much more likely to be a preoccupation of adults who have been shielded, have been sheltered from death until too late.
I think that's right. I'm actually just thinking anecdotally, in our own family, my father, who lived with my mother in the same town as us, and therefore was very close with both of our children, died when they were 9 and 7, I believe, and had had literally a near-death experience, like heart stopped for 20 minutes. A year before, and was in the ICU for many months, actually. And then we got a year of life out of him, but in that interim year. So really that happened when Toby, our younger son, was 6. And there's a lot to say about this, but never, ever did it occur to either of us to protect our children from their grandfather. As he was getting sicker, and as he was, at risk of dying several times, and then, he made it through when he had many, many, many months of remarkable health before dying a year later. In fact, really, it was almost the opposite.
It was the opposite.
My parents had moved up to Olympia to be with us and really to be with their grandchildren. And they spent, I think they picked them up at that point, from school 3 days a week. And they spent, and we spent at least one evening, all of us at their house having dinner together. But, the kids spent a lot of time with their grandparents. And the idea that this would have been a moment to pull back, to, protect the children from an understanding that their grandfather was sick. No, we wanted them to lay down more memories of their grandfather, in case he did die, which ultimately he did. And that's sort of an unhelpful anecdote for those who are not in the unfortunate position of having someone with whom they want their child to be close who was potentially dying near them. But the idea being, death has always been more a part of life than we moderns like to think.
Yeah, it's been sanitized out of our life because it's difficult.
Yeah.
Our kids were rushed to your parents' house when your dad had his heart attack, and we were in fact told that he was gone. And then we got a revised report many minutes later that in fact he was not gone.
Well, I think, and I think I've told that story maybe on Greg Ellis's podcast.
You talked about it on DarkHorse.
I've talked about it on DarkHorse too. Okay. But I think, it was early in the morning, and my mother called me and said, your dad's having a heart attack. They lived, 8 minutes away or so by car. I happened to be up. It was like the first week of the quarter. I happened to be up. It was 6 a.m. working on curriculum. And otherwise my phone wouldn't have been on. And I think my father would have died, because I said, okay, I'm coming over. And I ran upstairs to get socks or something and wasn't totally quiet, and woke you and said, I have to go. My dad's having a heart attack. And you sat up. You said, I'm getting the boy. I said, no, God, no. I'm like, I am going. And you said no.
Yeah, we had to be there.
And you drove, and therefore it was, 2/3 the time that it should have taken, as opposed to the usual short time that it would have taken. And I asked you to stay in the car with the boys. I said, I don't know. And there were, 3 or 4 emergency vehicles in the driveway. And by this time it's like 6:20 or something. And I went, and the door was locked, which is weird. And I banged on it, and my mother opened it, and there was like 8 or 10 first responders. My dad is on the floor. My dad was a big guy, and there were, 8 or 10 guys working on him. And my mother said, he just told us. He just told me he's gone. And I hugged my mom, and very shortly thereafter, you guys knocked on the door. And I don't know if it was 3, 4, 5 minutes after I'd gone in, but there you were once again, disobeying my request to stay in the car.
35 seconds.
Well, it wasn't minutes later then, because you had said minutes later, which is why I guessed that. Hold on. And you came to the door. I opened the door, and it was you standing there with our 2 little boys, right?
Yep.
Like 6 and 8. And it was all men, all these first responders sort of, like who keeps coming to the door at this point, right? Like it's 6:30 in the morning, and you've got these 2 boys who are standing there it's clearly their grandfather, and they clearly love him, and they'd already been working on him for 20 minutes, and who knows how long before that his heart had stopped. They hadn't been there before that. And they brought him back. And they brought him back at the point that they really thought they had done everything they could, I think, because you were standing there with our children, revealing to them that this was a man who was much loved.
Yeah, this was important.
Much loved. And it was really touch and go for many weeks, closing in on 2, maybe even more than 2 months after that. But we then got another year with him.
We did.
And I don't think he would have survived had you guys not come to the door.
I think that's quite possible. It's also true that when your dad finally did die, our children were there. And when he was cremated, we insisted on being present too. And the point is, all of those things are, it isn't the natural process, but it is an analog for the natural process in which you would have very close contact with people in the process of dying, and then dealing with the body afterwards. And there's just no way we're not programmed for this, right? It's too much a normal feature of life. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have responded more to the question of sort of how do you bring an experience of death and a normalizing experience of death back into a child's life who lives in such a secular world in which death has been distanced. But I think the thing, and I think maybe we'll save this for another time, but the aspect of the question that we didn't get to is how do you deal with the what for many people is a terror of permanent absence, and that that too will happen to you, will happen to everyone, and that is something that religion does make easier, I imagine.
Yeah, although there's also a very simple philosophical way of dealing with it, which is, that happens. You will be returned to the state you were in before you were, and it's not bad.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You say things like that. It's not bad. Really? How do you know?
Well, because I spent a very long time there. In fact, I believe Mark Twain has something he said about it. The equivalent of, it didn't bother me a bit.
Well, he's back there now, isn't he?
Yes, he is. And I imagine he's okay with it.
I think he's not okay with it, but I also think he's not okay with it.
He's right there on the knife's edge between them.
Right.
Yes.
All right. I feel like we were doing well, and that last bit is just not helpful at all.
So
but
helpful.
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I know. But
next week, I think we may be back in our normal set. I don't know. Who knows?
See,
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. As long as the quail don't get in the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
I hadn't even considered that. I thought we'd faced them. We dealt with it.
I don't know. I
But
feel like
you're
the
right,
quail
they
will
could
always
be
keep
back.
coming back.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Be good to the ones you love. Eat good food and get outside.
Be well, everyone.